Welcome to week 2 of Literature and Mental Health.
Our course about how literature can help us to cope with some of the most stressful things that life throws at us.
Jonathan, you're known especially for your work on Shakespeare. Why is it that Shakespeare seems to be able to teach us more about human nature than any other writer?
Well, I think it's partly because of his great range of work. He writes tragedies and comedies. He writes about great people and ordinary people. But in the end, it's because all the great dilemmas and conflicts that make us human, relationships between men and women, parents and children, between public life and private life, between the living and the dead, all those great fundamental human conflicts and dilemma are there in Shakespeare.
Do you think there's any other writer that can begin to compare with Shakespeare?
Well, I think there is just one, actually, and it's the great Russian novelist, Tolstoy. One of my favourite movies is Woody Allen's movie Love and Death, which is a kind of parody of the whole of Russian literature. But I think what Woody Allen gets at there, the idea that the two central things in life are love and death and how we cope with them. And Tolstoy is amazing on that. Anna Karenina is the great novel about love. His short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyinich, great novel about death. And then War and Peace. It has both love and death. And love and death are the subjects we're going to look at in the next 2 weeks. This week, love, next week, death. But I suspect, Paula, you've got a different answer to the question as to whether there's anybody else who lives up to Shakespeare, who matches up to Shakespeare.
Well, I think the only other writer that can compare with Shakespeare is probably Jane Austen, who is the great 18th century writer about love. One of the key texts will be Sense and Sensibility, which looks at two contrasting ways of dealing with love and heartbreak.
And I suppose one of the things about a novel is that it's an expansive form. So Jane Austen is able to give a lot of space to her characters, really to enter into the minds of these two girls.
Well, she does, and where she's quite unusual is having a contrasting pair of heroines who have a very different way of dealing with heartbreak, so we can get inside the minds, the characters of the two heroines. She's quite pioneering in that sense of having two heroines at the centre of the romantic courtship novel.
Well, you're talking about those terms, romance and courtship, and let's just go back to Shakespeare for a moment, because of course there is an enormously long history associating literature with love. Poetry is very often love poetry. We tend to sort of woo people with love poetry, and of course Shakespeare is a great example of that. I mean, Shakespeare's sonnets, this extraordinary collection of poems that seem to explore every single dimension of the experience of falling in love, falling out of love. There's also a wonderful moment in Hamlet where Hamlet seems to have gone mad. He comes into Ophelia's room with his hair all over the place and his socks down by his ankles, and he seems in a terrible state. And Ophelia tells her father Polonius about this, and Polonius is convinced that Hamlet has literally been driven mad by love. Now, that idea that love is a form of madness, a form of sickness, was very widely believed in Shakespeare's time. There's a wonderful description shortly after Shakespeare's death of this idea of love as a kind of sickness, a kind of mental illness. It's written by a man called Robert Burton. He was a great scholar, and he wrote a huge book called The Anatomy of Melancholy, which was an encyclopedic account of every kind of mental illness imaginable. And Burton's sources were the great literary texts of the past. He was a voracious reader, and he gutted just about every book from classical antiquity to get ideas about mental disturbances of various kinds. And love sickness, or love melancholy, as he calls it, is one of the great examples of that. This is what Burton wrote about the condition. Symptoms or signs of love melancholy in body, mind, good, bad, etc. Symptoms are either of body or mind. Of body, paleness, leanness, dryness, etc. As the poet describes lovers, love causeth leanness, hollow-eyed, their eyes are hidden in their heads, they pine away and look ill with waking, cares, sighs, want of appetite. The green sickness often happeneth to young women. Then Burton speaks about a particular story in classical literature of a woman in love who was half distracted and spake she knew not what, sighed to herself, lay much awake, and was lean upon a sudden. We'd call that anorexia or weight loss. Then another one, Euryalus in the epistle to Lucretia, his mistress, complainst among other grievances, thou hast taken my stomach and my sleep from me. The idea that being in love means you lose your appetite and you lose your sleep. And then this poet is quoted. His sleep, his meat, his drink, in him bereft, that lean he waxeth and dry as a shaft. His eyes hollow and grisly to behold, his hue pale and ashen to unfold. And solitary he was ever alone, and waking all the night, making moan.
Well, I think the symptoms of that echo almost precisely the symptoms of Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility. It's a checklist of being in love and being heartbroken, the listlessness, the lack of appetite, not being able to sleep. You know, one feels if Marianne went to her GP, she'd tick all of those boxes. And it's incredible that this was written all those years ago, and yet it would describe what it feels like for most of us still to be heartbroken, to be in love.
That's an amazing thing, isn't it? To think that the examples Burton takes are from classical antiquity, 2,000 years ago. Then there's Burton himself and Shakespeare describing these symptoms 400 years ago, in the early 1600s. There's Jane Austen doing it 200 years after that, round about 1800. And you went to see Dr. Andrew Schumann, and he suggested that maybe those same symptoms are visible today in the GP's waiting room.